Good morning, everyone. Let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow to all. Dear Swamiji, help us to understand the meaning of the words that you received for this discipleship vow. Help us to feel behind these simple concepts the power of the Spirit that lives there. We sincerely and deeply aspire to be in tune with God. Help us to fulfill that aspiration every moment, every day, until it becomes effortless to live in constant attunement with Thee. Om, peace. Amen. Okay. So we're at the very end. We're still at the very end. We'll be there for another couple of days of the expanded vow of discipleship. It's not the expanded vow, it's simply the vow, but it's longer than what Swami wrote when he first came up with the idea of having a separate vow for discipleship. And we're in the very last section of it. We've been reading, discipline me, guide me, purify me. And I'll remind you that this whole vow is really to Divine Mother, and the gurus are her instrument in making this happen for us. Discipline, guide me, purify me. That's what we say first. And then it says, teach me to attune myself to thy ray. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the ray, which we have talked about some, and also what the word attunement means. We've had it all the way through. But I was interested that he says, teach me. Attuning to the ray is such a subtle idea, and in a certain sense, you can make up a meaning for it, and then you're not even really quite sure exactly what it means. So attunement is the fundamental issue on the spiritual path. When Swamiji, in a different context, was talking about meditation and attunement and so on, and he was talking about disciples who were advanced with Master and how Master talked about, this is what I'm trying to say. Swamiji said when Master was teaching in public, he would teach many things. He would talk about the techniques and the philosophy and all these different things. But when he was with the disciples, Swami said what he talked about was attunement. And it was sort of like once he attracted people, let me see if I can think about how to say this. It's when we first start out on the spiritual path, as I've said many times in the course of this series, we have to have a certain amount of personal power in order to be able to do that, because we have to be able to take a stand against the current, which everyone else in society thinks is normal. I've lived so much of my life in the context of an ashram. I've been surrounded by people whose values are essentially, in the most essential ways, are the same as mine. And I get the impression that the way we think inside Ananda is common. But of course it isn't. And it isn't in the sense that Maya holds sway and people simply believe it. We've been through this political process in America the last few days. This is about the 10th of November, and the American elections was on November 3rd. So we've been just sort of watching this whole flow of intense energy. And I've been interested in it, of course. I mean, you would have to you'd have to have no functioning brain cells not to be interested in it. I mean, it's just too weird and exciting and amazing as just as a dramatist, if nothing else. the characters are all larger than life, except they are here in life, and the twists and turns of the plot are just too marvelous not to want to sort of stand at least in the third row and watch what's going on. Plus, of course, a great deal is at stake, so it's slightly irresponsible. Slightly irresponsible. A person can turn their back on it if you want to. I have to be in touch with people all the time. So for me, it's important that I have at least some idea of what people are thinking. But repeatedly, over and over again, watching the story, watching people's feelings about, whether who won, who lost, and how committed a person was to either side of that, there's this deep involvement and belief that all of these external events are the reality of life and are the important plot line. They're an interesting plot line, that's absolutely for sure, but that they're the definitive plot line. Whereas in the world that I've lived in for a very long time and continue to live in, the definitive plot line is my individual response to those events. It's not that those events are not relevant to my life for many reasons. It's worth noting in the path when Swamiji introduces himself in the early chapters and talks about his autobiography, when he talks about his childhood and his family and his extended family and who they were and so on. He makes at the end of all of that, he makes a very interesting statement. He said, "I came into this world fully myself." And that was a statement about his state of consciousness, but it's also absolutely true for all of us. As Swami says, the mother and the father create the physical body so that the soul can express its destiny, but they do not create the soul or its destiny. The soul and its destiny is an act of God, guided by the divine, and is always in our own hands. Our own destiny is our own response to circumstances. So then Swami explains in the path that the reason he described his family in such detail is so that the reader will understand the forces with which he chose to associate. And it's sort of like that family reflects something about his soul and his destiny. So I think the circumstances in which we find ourselves don't necessarily define us in any way, but they are the circumstances with which we chose to associate, because we did it on purpose. We would, if this period of time was not exactly right for us, we would have chosen another. Now, when there was a cycle at Ananda Village, there was this man, Brian Powers, wonderful, wonderful man. His name became Bajrang later in his life. And he worked with the children. He taught in the school, and he was kind of a favorite uncle to a great many children in our community. He really did a wonderful service for many years in that way. And at one point, in a community based on reincarnation, where you understand that the soul chooses its own destiny, when a child says to its mother, as adolescents often do, or its father, "You're a terrible mother. I don't want you to be my mother anymore." The mother can say back, "It's not my fault. You chose to be born to me," which is really an annoying thing to be able to say to a teenager. And not all of them by any means accepted that as a true statement. So in one context, one of these kids, several of these kids went to Brian and said, "I would never have chosen them." It's just, I would never have chosen them. So Brian comes to Swami Kriyananda and says, "Sir, what should I do? Because I know, in fact, from the philosophical point of view, that they did come for a reason." And then Brian said, frankly, "But sometimes I don't understand why they chose those parents either." And so he said, "I just don't know how to answer them honestly." But Swami's answer was interesting. He said, "You'll choose a situation for the general trend." He said, "You won't necessarily choose it for every single detail." He said, for example, and he used his own life as an example, the primary relationship in his family was with his mother. And he said he came for his mother, and most of the rest of the family came with her, but he didn't choose the whole family. He chose her, and then the karmas all begin to blend and all these things happen. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that what happens is not appropriate. It just means that you can't always like drill it down to the last tiny little point. So the relevant point is, how does this make me respond? What does this awaken in me? What does this experience cause to happen? And primarily, well, what does it awaken in me that draws me closer to God? And what does it awaken in me that causes me to pull away from that right understanding? So I think tumultuous times, and times when we feel threatened by individuals around us, when the world is not going the way we want it to go, when the way the world is going causes us great disillusionment, and we begin to lose some of our outraged innocence about the way we think things ought to be. All of these are tremendous incentives for deeper understanding. Why does this frighten me? Why does this anger me? Why does this cause me to feel righteously indignant about the way things should be? And I'm not saying that those reactions are inherently either inappropriate or not exactly what we should have, but we can learn from them. So this is where Swami has this word, teach me to attune myself to thy ray. So in the midst of all of this, external drama has been going on recently, but even in the most placid of times, in the midst of this, what am I attuning to? And this whole concept of attunement is our key to understanding the spiritual path. We are not independent. If you start spreading out, just thinking about who you are and how you got here, your relationship, the fact that you're in this body, and this body was the product of a man and a woman who came together to create you. Who was that man? Who was that woman? How did they happen to come together? Why were you born in a particular place? Just all of these different things. I think everything goes back to Adam and Eve, if you could just keep following it. So it's not as if I can cut my little life out, my little square of 1947 to 2020, just sort of say this happened independently of all other influences. Of course it didn't. So at all times, we're being influenced by something. I remember as a teenager when I began to think about these things, and I began to think about fashion and the clothes that I wore and what I thought was attractive and how I presented myself and how I cut my hair, and just all these little things which were in and of themselves superficial. But my whole idea of how I was supposed to look and how dress and how I was supposed to present myself, where did it come from? It was completely arbitrary. And I just picked it up from the ether around me. And the fashions would change, and my tastes would suddenly change with the fashions. Swami actually made a comment once. He said, those who go with fashion have no taste of their own. It was a pretty hard statement, but what he was really saying was, what are we just being dictated to by the forces around us, or are we genuinely expressing something that comes from the inside of us? In other words, it's not a question of whether we're going to be acting from outside influences. It's a question only of what influences we are going to allow which influences we're going to accept. Swami made a comment once. He said whenever he found himself at all going with the fad, he would always on principle pull back, to just make sure he hadn't just gotten swept up in the tide, because the tide is very strong. So teach me to attune myself to thy ray is to say, in the midst, now I'm talking a lot about external realities, but we're also working at all times with very deeply held internal realities. And the art of being in tune with God's grace is that we also have to separate ourselves from those habitual things that feel right and comfortable to us merely because they are the ones that we ourselves have chosen. I was raised in a Jewish family. I was not raised in a particularly Jewish culture, like some people I know were, where their neighborhoods and their schools and their synagogue was really the defining reality. That was not true. But nonetheless, there was a quality to the family that I grew up in that had certain characteristics that I can only describe them as Jewish. A certain intellectuality, a certain avidness, positive qualities of kind of the being always ready to fight for the truth, to stand up for the truth, a little bit of a feeling of being. I mean, you had to make your own way. It came to me when a friend of mine was talking about the crystal punch bowl and the cups that go with it that had belonged to her grandmother or her great grandmother, I'm not sure which. It had been passed down in the family, and now there were several siblings, and there was going to have to be a decision made as to who got to keep grandmother's crystal punch bowl and matching cups. Now, quite apart from whether or not personally I would care about a crystal punch bowl, which part of my upbringing was that I don't. But that's also just, I've just been a renunciate in a little stone cell for too long. And a crystal punch bowl would really just be in the way in circumstances like that. But there was this other amazing quality to it. And it took me a little while to figure out what was so odd to me. You actually have something that's been in your family for generations, something valuable and fragile, and your family still has it. And then I thought of my Jewish upbringing. But, every generation or so, you get thrown out of the country, whatever country had welcomed you, they decide to expel you. Periodically, they imprison you. Sometimes they kill you. You certainly can't manage to keep a crystal punch bowl for all those generations. And my friend was just as astonished that you wouldn't have it. But you see, what are we thinking about? What are we attuning ourselves to? I've decided to associate. I don't have a Jewish soul, but I decided to associate with Judaism for many reasons that are very subtle that I've been learning from. Why did I choose to associate with them? Some of them good, not all of them good. Some negative qualities I've picked up too. But what am I attuning myself to? Because what I really want to attune myself to is I want to attune myself to the transcendent voice of my guru, of God, of Divine Mother, that is giving me a single message, which is that your only goal in life is self-realization, and any aspect of self-identity that I cling to, that I nestle down and feel comfortable in, this is who I am sort ofness, I have to ask myself very profoundly and very deeply, is this helping me to draw closer to God, or is this just the comfort zone where I just go back into a default? I've heard so many people say, actually, just where there was a period of time, these things tend to happen in waves, where very often in conversation people would say, well, it's just the way I was raised. Well, it was just the way I was raised. Well, I mean, like, yes, it was the way you were raised, but do you want to die as you were born? And if, meaning, do you want this life to have no progress? Do you want to sort of, at the end of your life, be able to say, I clung to everything I was born into. I remained loyal to what I knew when I was born and I never changed a bit. Like, is that actually where you want to be? There's an expression in India that says it's good fortune to be born into a religion, but a misfortune to die in it. And that seems like sort of an odd thing to say. But the point is, we're supposed to progress from when we're born to when we die. And progress on the spiritual path means we become ever freer, ever less identified, and even more powerfully, ever less compelled, because it's the compulsion that's the issue. It's not a question of whether I am or am not. Jewish has been very interesting for me, and having gone to Israel only in the last few years, and having to really sort of see Judaism in its modern I mean, Israel, of course, is it just has this power. It was fascinating to me, has been fascinating to me. And I asked myself the question, why do I still identify as Jewish? And it's just been a very interesting, is identifying as Jewish actually taking me closer to God? Or is it some karmic habit that I've just been carrying for a really long time? And even what is it that I'm really identifying with? Is it cultural? But why would I want to be part of a particular culture? I don't want to be part of anything. When we're really in tune with God, it's the power of the Spirit to be whatever He needs you to be. See, one of the things that happens when we're in tune with the divine is that Divine Mother can use us. We can serve her because we're able to be whatever circumstances need. If we're holding on to, I am this kind of person, I can only do this, I have to be in this environment, this is what I have to have, this is who I am. I remember in a certain circumstance, well, when I was 18 and 19 years old, I realized that my relatively amenable personality was also based on the fact that I was very uncomfortable with conflict. And I realized it wasn't wholesome for me to be so uncomfortable with conflict. I was using a spiritual justification. We ought to get along and be harmonious to justify what was actually a great fear of sort of stepping outside of that little bubble. So I learned to realize that we can argue, we can raise our voices, we can assert ourselves, and it's not the end of the world. Everything will just keep rolling on. It was very interesting a number of years after that, like maybe as many as, well, it would have been about 6 or 7 years later. I was in a very particular circumstance working with a group of women, and we were all under a lot of pressure. And one of the girls in the group had a very explosive temperament. She had the opposite of me. She had a very explosive temperament. And she was becoming really angry. She was just becoming angry because she was under pressure and it was upsetting to her. But I realized she needs somebody to yell at. And I would be a very good person for her to yell at because it's not going to bother me if she does. Whereas if she really lets loose to various other choices, it could come out quite badly. So I just had sort of a screaming fight with her, which didn't last long because she was a straw fire. She just flared up. She yelled at me. I yelled at her. She yelled at me. I yelled at her. Then we began to de-escalate slowly. And in a matter of 2 or 3 minutes, the whole thing was past. It meant nothing to either of us, and we just went on. But it was a very important teaching for me because I thought to myself, if I had not freed myself from the fear that I held of just this kind of encounter, I wouldn't have been able to help her. And so being attuned is to be able to be a clear and open instrument so that whatever is needed, it occurs to me to do it and I'm able to do it. Swamiji was so solid in himself. I mean, he was so deeply rooted in the only identification that mattered to him, which was he was a disciple of a great master. That was who he was. And so whenever he was with other people, he could just sort of see what they might need and just be able to be he had nothing to protect. And there was nothing in him that could only do this or could only do that. It was whatever Master wanted of him. So of all the influences that are coming to us, we ask Master, teach me to attune myself to your ray. And then you can flow through me. You can flow into me and you can flow through me. I was aware in one seclusion, many of you have heard me say this, but I was in seclusion once, and the tendency in a meditation is that we are giving. We're focusing on the light and we're offering ourselves into that light. But in this meditation, it occurred to me that I should allow Divine Mother to love me, because she does. And the Kuredar said, if you knew how much God loves you, you would die for joy. So I thought perhaps I could die for joy if I allowed myself to experience that. But it was extraordinarily interesting to me, because when I really tried to just opened my heart, I could feel that there was well, I was going to say a glass ceiling, but that's not really what I mean. You might call it a glass door, that there was a profound fear of opening my heart to that extent, even to God. Protection of countless vrittis of I want it this way, I don't want it that way. Countless past life experiences of being hurt and having risked and having stood up and been assassinated. And I mean, I tell my own stories and everybody else tells me theirs. You know, all the times that I stood up and was burned at the stake. And so I don't really want to stand out again when I put my life on the line for God and it didn't really work out very well. When I dedicated myself to this teaching and the guru turned out to be false. You know, when I left everything behind for God and was disappointed in the end. Trust me, we've all had those experiences. And I was holding on to them, just holding on to them. And as a result, I would let God into my life to a certain extent, but I always had to keep a piece of me really protected. In other words, I couldn't attune myself completely. I was still vibrating with all the reasons why I had to be afraid. Teach me to attune myself to thy ray, because only when we're willing to give it all up. Sister Gyanamata said, you know, that she gradually learned that everything had to be given up, even those things that were perfectly fine, that were right, you know, that belonged to her, that there was no obvious external reason why she needed to sacrifice them. She doesn't enumerate, but I'm sure she didn't just mean physical objects. It just means self-definitions. Because insofar as we define ourselves by any limited reality, that's how much space we have to hold rather than allowing the grace of God to flow in. Because that's what attunement to the ray is. Attunement to the ray is being able to live in that ray of grace. The ray is the ray of grace. And Divine Mother wants to take us and guide us and bless us and expand us. But if I want to remain attuned to whatever, fill in your own list of all these different identities. I'm still mad at this person. I'm still afraid of this one. I'm still proud of this quality. I'm still anxious about not doing well enough over here. The list, we all have our own list. We all feel it. And that what we're doing is we're attuning to those things because they don't really exist. I mean, think about it. What are they? They're not rocks that we can hold in our hands. They're vibrations of consciousness. And when we're vibrating on a certain consciousness, by definition, we can't vibrate on the other. So we're just wanting to just relax that hold. Just let it just wash away. I mean, every master tells us it's so much easier than we think, that all the effort is to hold on. And once we realize that we can just let go, I had a delirium once when I had this high fever. I rarely had a high fever, but I did this one time. And I remember in the height, I didn't understand that I was delirious, of course, because I was so inexperienced with that sort of thing. But for a period of time in that delirium, I was lying in my bed and I was in the fetal position, and I was holding on really tight to the fetal position because I was convinced that if I relaxed, and especially if I stretched out, that my four limbs would separate from my body. I mean, in my mind, I could see it. My two legs would run one direction and my two arms would run the other direction, and I would just be left with a torso and a head. And I was so convinced of it that I had to remain curled up. And then as the fever began to go down, I began to sort of remember that there had been times in my life when I wasn't so tightly curled up in the fetal position, and that in fact my arms and legs had remained on my torso. And I remember carefully reasoning this out and very carefully sort of uncurling myself to see what would happen. Well, that's us. We're just curled up in the fetal position, clinging to these, attuning ourselves to false realities with the belief that something terrible will happen to us when we let go. And the art of the spiritual path is just to realize, in fact, I don't need any of that. In fact, that's what's causing me pain. And if I just let it go, teach me, Divine Mother, to attune myself to thy ray, that your grace can flow through me and I can become who I am destined by God to be, which is one with your light. God bless you.